All right, let's dive into Emerson. We've got a ton of his stuff to get through today, essays, poems, even some personal letters.
Sounds like we're in for a real journey through his mind, huh?
It's going to be a deep dive for sure, and I'm hoping we can really go beyond those, those typical self-reliance quotes you always hear.
Absolutely. Emerson was so much more than just that. His ideas were really influential, even today. He was engaging with some really important issues of his time.
Okay, well, let's jump right in then. We can start with the Lord's Supper from Miscellanies.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. He really gets going there. It's actually why he ended up leaving his job as a pastor.
Yeah, he really challenges traditional Christianity in that one, head on.
He did, and you can see in that piece how he was really pushing people to think differently about, well, their beliefs in general. He wasn't afraid of controversy.
So how does that fit in with his own spirituality? I mean, wasn't he a deeply spiritual person?
Yeah. He was. But he didn't believe that true spirituality was, limited to just rituals or doctrines. Like, he saw the divine everywhere, in everyday life, in nature, even within ourselves.
That makes a lot of sense when you think about his essay, Nature. He seems to find spiritual lessons everywhere in nature.
Right. He compares it to, like, the way kids learn language. It's about finding meaning in the world around you through experience and observation, understanding the symbols.
It's like he's saying, wake up, pay attention to the world.
Exactly. And for Emerson, nature wasn't just a pretty background. It was this, this living text, like full of symbols pointing to deeper meaning. And he wanted us to see those connections, be more mindful.
I love that. And it makes you think about his essay, Manners, from Poems. He talks about shopkeeping civility, which he clearly wasn't a fan of.
No, he wasn't. He thought true gentlemanliness wasn't about like wealth or fancy etiquette. It was about character.
Inner character.
Right. Being authentic and following your own moral compass, not just blindly following social expectations.
He was a big believer in being true to yourself.
Huge. And this idea of nonconformity comes up a lot in his work. He wanted people to cultivate their individuality, not just conform to societal pressures.
Hey, you see that in his activism too, right? Like those anti-slavery speeches in Miscellanies.
Absolutely. He didn't hold back at all, calling slavery a legal crime. He was very outspoken about it.
He definitely wasn't shy about standing up for what he believed in.
No, not at all. And it's important to remember his activism wasn't just, like, theoretical. He was involved with the Underground Railroad.
Really? So he was putting his beliefs into action, helping people escape slavery. That's pretty amazing.
It is. It shows how deeply he cared about these issues. And speaking of connections, what about his friendship with Thomas Carlyle?
Oh yeah, their letters. The correspondence of Thomas Carlyle and Ralph Waldo Emerson. It's amazing to read their back and forth.
It's like getting a glimpse into their minds, right? These two intellectual giants just going back and forth about ideas and life.
It's fascinating. And it's not just like dry philosophy either. They're talking about their struggles, their doubts, even poking fun at each other sometimes.
It really humanizes them, It shows they were just people trying to figure things out, just like the rest of us. But, brilliant people, obviously.
And there's a lot of humor in those letters, too. Like, there's this one where Carlyle is talking about the importance of, like, rightly holding his peace.
Yeah, a little ironic coming from him. He was known for being quite outspoken.
But it also makes you wonder if they both saw silence, as a way to connect with deeper truths.
Maybe it was their way of finding stillness, a way to get past all the noise and chatter of the world and connect with something deeper.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's like this theme of introspection keeps popping up in his work. He wasn't just about outward action. He was also really interested in cultivating that inner world.
And that's something we can all learn from, I think, taking the time to reflect and connect with ourselves. It's a valuable lesson, even today. It's interesting to think about Emerson's travel writing, too, like in English Traits.
Oh, yeah, where he compares the English to a pig.
Right. He saw them as very skilled and hardworking, but also kind of limited in their worldview.
Yeah, and he contrasts that with America, the vastness of it, the sense of freedom and possibility.
Exactly. And I think those travels really influenced his thinking. He was fascinated by different cultures and how they approach life, work, nature, even just everyday things. Like he tells this funny story about meeting an English lady on the Rhine who insisted that she wasn't the foreigner.
Oh, I love that. He had a great sense of humor.
He did, and you can see that in a lot of his writing. But, he wasn't just poking fun. He genuinely admired the English for their practicality, their sense of history.
Yeah, and he even appreciated their gardens, even though they were, a bit more controlled than the American wilderness.
Right, like those gardens were a reflection of their character. Carefully tended, ordered, rooted in tradition. It makes me think about Emerson's own creative process. In Poetry and Imagination from Letters and Social Aims, he says, the poet discovers that what men value as substances have a higher value as symbols. What do you think he means by that?
Hmm, that's a good question. It's like he's saying that art isn't just about describing things, it's about revealing their deeper meaning. Like, poetry can show us the connections between, well, the material world and the spiritual world, the things we see and the things we don't.
Exactly. For Emerson, the poet was this kind of like a seer, someone who could unlock those hidden truths and help us see them. It's not about, pretty words or rhyming. It's about using language to illuminate the mysteries of
And
existence.
he definitely experimented with language in his own poetry. Like, the poems are all over the place. Traditional forms, free verse, personal reflections, big philosophical statements.
Right. And there's this real intellectual depth to them, but also, emotional resonance. He blends myth and history, nature imagery, personal experiences. It's really unique. Like the Adirondacks, that poem about a camping trip,
Yeah.
becomes this whole meditation on, nature, friendship, the search for meaning.
Oh, and that line about chronic dyspepsia not coming from eating indigestible food.
Haha. Yeah, that one always gets me. So classic Emerson, quirky but thought-provoking.
Like he's saying, pay attention to the unexpected. There's wisdom to be found everywhere,
Okay.
even in indigestion.
And that ties into his idea of, always expanding our horizons, which he talks about in Circles from Essays.
Always challenging our assumptions, embracing new perspectives. It's that whole life is a journey, not a destination kind of thing.
And he believed that was important for individuals, but also for society, like in his essay Politics, he talks about how clinging to outdated ideas holds us back. Progress requires adaptation, evolution.
So we're seeing this theme of growth, self-improvement, but also, responsibility to contribute to society.
Absolutely. He was really grappling with that tension, between individual freedom and the common good.
It's a balance, isn't it?
It is, and it's something we're still wrestling with today. But there's also this thread of optimism in his work, this belief in human potential. Like, he really thought we could create a better world.
And that comes through in how he redefines wealth, right?
Yeah. In his essay, Wealth from the Conduct of Life, he talks about it not just being about money and possessions, but about inner resources, character, creativity.
About contributing something meaningful to the world.
Exactly. It's a message that's so relevant today, When we're so focused on material things, Emerson reminds us that true abundance comes from who we are and how we connect with the world.
I bet he'd have a lot to say about our obsession with social media.
Oh, for sure. But I think he'd also see some positive things like, the progress we've made on social justice, the growing awareness of our interconnectedness, even the interest in spirituality and mindfulness.
Yeah, that's true. It's like that tension we keep coming back to, the individual and the collective.
Right. He was all about self-reliance, but also using that strength to build a better society.
And that self-reliance, it came from being grounded in your own values, your own intuition. He wanted people to be nonconformists, to think for themselves, to dare to be different.
It's a powerful message, and it's still relevant.
Absolutely. But we can't forget that he was also just a brilliant writer. His prose is full of vivid imagery, metaphors, and those unforgettable quotes.
Oh, totally. Like, to be great is to be misunderstood, or finish each day and be done with it. Simple, but so profound.
They stick with you, don't they? Like little
Yeah.
nuggets of wisdom. And he wasn't afraid to get deep, metaphysical. Like in The Oversoul, he talks about this idea of a universal spirit that connects us all.
Which was pretty radical for its time, but it speaks to that, that longing for connection and meaning that so many people feel.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that makes Emerson so fascinating. He was always wrestling with those big questions about life, death, the human condition.
And he did it with such honesty and intelligence. He wasn't offering easy answers, but he was giving us a framework for thinking about these things, And I think that's what makes his work so enduring.
He was a real trailblazer,
Yeah.
a thinker who challenged the status quo and inspired others to do the same.
Absolutely. And his influence is still felt today, not just in literature and philosophy, but in our culture as a whole.
It's amazing to think that a writer from the 19th century can still speak to us so directly in the 21st century.
It is. It really is. And it's a testament to the power of his ideas. He gave us this vision of human potential that I think still resonates with people all over the world.
We've covered a lot of ground today, but it feels like we've only just scratched the surface of Emerson's work.
I know, right? It's so vast and there's so much to explore. But hopefully this has given you a new appreciation for his thinking.
It definitely has for me. Emerson's writings are treasure trove. I mean, there's just so much wisdom and inspiration there.
They are, and I really encourage you to keep diving in. Let his ideas challenge you, spark your imagination, and, guide you on your own journey.
That's a great way to put it. But before we wrap up, I wanted to circle back to something we touched on earlier, Emerson's relationship with silence. It's something that comes up again and again in his work.
Yeah, it's a fascinating aspect of his thinking. Like in his essay Friendship, he talks about how real friends can just be together in silence.
Just be present with each other.
Exactly. It's about those pauses in conversation where you can really connect, maybe even more deeply than when you're talking.
It's like those unspoken moments where hearts and minds can really meet.
Yeah, I love that. And it's not just in personal relationships. He saw the value of silence and creativity, too. Like in Inspiration, he talks about how sometimes you just can't force yourself to write.
You need to create space for the inspiration to come through.
Right. You have to be receptive, listen to those quiet whispers of the muse.
It's like he's telling us to be more comfortable with the pauses, the silence, those gaps in our lives.
Absolutely. That's where the magic happens, right? It's in those quiet moments that we can really connect with ourselves, and that's often when those creative breakthroughs happen.
Such a powerful idea and kind of a challenge in our world today where everything is so noisy and busy.
Definitely. We're constantly bombarded with information and stimulation. It's like we're afraid of silence. But Emerson reminds us that there's so much to be gained from those quiet spaces, from stillness.
I love that.
Yeah.
A call to cultivate more stillness in our lives. Speaking of quiet reflection, I keep thinking back to his historical discourse at Concord, where he talks about the townspeople creating these very specific rules for their community.
Oh, yeah. Some of those rules are pretty detailed, like the one about keeping your hair comely in the English style. Can you imagine?
It's fascinating. And there was another one about not mourning too loudly. No great noise by howling.
Right. Like even in a community founded on individual freedom, there was still this recognition of the need for shared guidelines, a sense of social responsibility.
It's all about finding that balance, isn't it? Individual expression, but also a commitment to the common good.
Exactly. And it's something Emerson illustrated so beautifully in that same historical discourse with his account of the Battle of Concord. Those ordinary citizens, farmers, shopkeepers standing up to the British troops.
Not as soldiers, but as people defending their homes, their values, their way of life.
It's such a powerful image of courage and resilience. It speaks to his belief in the power of ordinary individuals to make a difference. You don't need to be a general or a politician to be brave and stand up for what you believe in.
It's a powerful message, and you see that commitment to justice throughout Emerson's work. But he also understood the dangers of unchecked individualism,
Yeah.
of putting personal gain over the well-being of society.
Right, like in his lecture at New York, where he criticizes the fugitive slave law. He saw it as undermining the very foundation of America, the ideals of justice and freedom.
For him, it wasn't just a moral feeling. It was a betrayal of the American ideal.
Yeah, he really felt that. And in his later writings, he becomes even more outspoken in his call to action, like on affairs in Kansas and his speeches on John Brown. He's urging people to get involved, to fight for justice and equality.
To hold their leaders accountable.
Absolutely. He understood that democracy requires participation. It's not just about voting. It's about being actively engaged in shaping the kind of world you want to live in.
And his speeches on John Brown are so interesting because he admired Brown's courage, but he didn't agree with his violent methods.
Right. It shows how nuanced he was. He didn't shy away from difficult questions. And I think that's what makes his work so valuable. He challenges us to think critically, to recognize the complexity of the world.
To be engaged citizens.
Exactly. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Emerson, I hope it's clear that he was so much more than just the self-reliance guy. He was a complex thinker, a writer, a social critic, an activist, and a voice that I think still has a lot to teach us today.
Absolutely. He gave us so much to think about, so many ways to approach life, to connect with ourselves, to engage with the world. It's been an amazing journey exploring his work.
It has. And I encourage everyone listening to keep diving into Emerson. Let his ideas challenge you, inspire you, guide you.
He's definitely left a lasting mark on American thought, and his influence is still felt today.
Without a doubt.
Well, that about wraps it up for our deep dive into the world of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
Remember, keep those minds open, keep exploring, and keep diving deep. We'll see you on our next adventure.